Yeah, okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And again, apologies about the last minute changes, but thank you so much for coming. So my name is Elika Ansari. This is the second book that I'm publishing. It's called The 5 Stages of Moria, the Worst Refugee Camp on Earth. Before anyone says anything about the subtitle, notice it's in inverted commas. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So this is the second book, as I mentioned, that I'm publishing. The first one is quite different. It's a middle grade fantasy book about climate change. This is about a refugee camp in Lesbos, Greece, which burned down in 2020 September, during COVID period, during lockdown. So this is where I used to work. I moved to Greece in 2017, spring 2017. I was working in a refugee camp outside of Athens first. I went to Lesbos, where Moria is based, in December 2017, but then I had to leave shortly after because the project I was working in ended, and so basically I had to leave. I went to the north of Greece for 5 or 6 months to work in camps there, and then I came back to Lesbos in 2018. And since 2018 up till 2021, I was working in Lesbos, mostly in Moria refugee camp, in different organizations, namely Doctors Without Borders, MSF, which were quite frontline. So MSF was, they were just in front of the camp. It was a very big camp. It was so Moria camp was formerly a prison that they turned into a refugee camp because it's where a lot of refugees were arriving. It was a hotspot, Lesbos Island. So they had to turn that prison into a refugee camp. It was a transitory camp, so meaning that initially in 2015, when the so-called refugee crisis started, people were coming, they were staying in Moria for a couple of days, then they would get transferred to the mainland. But in 2016, the policy of containment was enforced after the EU-Turkey deal, meaning that the refugees would end up staying there for many months, some of them even many years. So that's when it became very, very complicated. Basically, as I say, it was a transitory camp. There were a lot of basic human rights were not being met. A lot of basic needs were not being met. Shelter. People were living in like summer camps in the middle of winter. There were 200 people per shower container at some point. In 2019, we had around more than 20,000 people in the camp, where there were meant to be only 3,000. So it was very, very difficult for them, for us, for the humanitarian workers as well. And things were happening very fast-paced, basically. It was very challenging for us as well, but you never had the time, if you were working there, to actually sit down and think about what is happening here. So you were just running around all the time. At some point, I stepped away. I was in lockdown. In 2020, I was in lockdown in Dubai. And I thought about writing this book because I had some time away. I had some time to think about it. And I started to sort of think about the situation there. And it came to me as the 5 stages of grief. So we've got shock, anger, guilt, depression, and acceptance. So I started to see Moria as this sort of monolithic traumatic experience that drew everybody together, no matter where they were from, who they were in their past lives. It's as if Moria was this equalizer that just this huge traumatic experience that they were all living through together. And not just the residents, even the humanitarian workers. I felt myself going through these stages as I was working there as well. So that's why I named the book The 5 Stages of Moria, the Worst Refugee Camp on Earth. The subtitle, it's how some of the residents refer to the camp. It's not factually accurate that it's the worst refugee camp on Earth. At the very least, it had some access to running water, which is more than can be said about some of the refugee camps in Bangladesh, for example. But it's how people were experiencing it. So I'll just read out the synopsis. So it's based around 5 main characters. It's fiction based on true stories, basically. So we've got Mahdi, who's an unaccompanied minor, Mariam, who's an aid worker, Abe, who's a young man who falls in love in the camp. We've got Zarifa, who's a single mother who's escaping an abusive husband, and Ferishta, who's a young girl. So it says, the voices of Moria refugee camp are unified in their grief. Homes, hope, and dignity are lost in amongst squalid living conditions and the omnipresent void where the illusion of salvation once lived. Based on true stories, this 5 Stages of Moria resurrects the largest refugee camp in Europe and bears witness to the monolithic trauma held within. In this blend of autobiography and fiction, the inhabitants of Moria not only grapple with the stages of grief, but also with the reality of a camp and a world in which they would otherwise be forgotten. So basically, also just to mention, I chose, so a lot of people ask me, why did I not write it as non-fiction? I chose to write it as fiction because I wanted to represent these stories in the voices that they were told to me. I felt it would have more of an impact, like it would come close to moving readers in the same way that I was moved when I was hearing these stories. It is fiction in the sense that the characters are blended a little bit, the stories are blended, but a lot of the stories are based on true stories that I actually heard or saw or somehow lived through while working there. Any questions so far?
The camp closes in September 20?
Yeah, it burned down. So basically, the residents, it's a bit of a story. So in 2020 January, the residents of the camp were put on a lockdown because of COVID, while the rest of the town was not. So they were free to roam about, but the camp was on lockdown. So they started seeing this lockdown as a bit of a political, technique to keep them sort of out of the town, to just what was needed to keep them out of the town. So they were on lockdown since January 2020, and no positive case had yet been identified in the camp or in town. So basically, imagine they were supposed to stay in their tents. They couldn't go out much. If they wanted to go to town at all, they had to go through this huge bureaucratic system, get permission from the police, have a really, really good reason why they need to go, mostly like medical. So frustrations on the rise. And then it wasn't until August when finally a COVID case was discovered in the camp. Then they were put in isolation. And the people who were identified as positive, they were asymptomatic. So they didn't really believe that they had COVID. They thought that this is being used, is another technique to oppress them, to separate them from their families, to put them in isolation. The isolation centers were very minimalistic, they were just blocks of, it was just whatever they could find. There was no real isolation center. So they saw this as another way of oppressing them, and it was a little bit kind of the last straw. So some of the residents actually took part in burning the camp down, and they started from the isolation center. So it was September 2020.
Yeah. It's amazing that there are 20,000 people, and it took so long before COVID affected, and there was such close proximity.
Yes, I'm sure COVID was already there. They were not just being tested so much, basically.
Yeah.
But most of the cases identified there were asymptomatic, which was so hard. Even after the camp burned down, they constructed a new camp, which many still refer to as the new Moria or Moria 2. Even then, it was still hard to convince them that they had COVID because, again, they didn't have very many symptoms. They just saw it as a way of like oppression, At the time, so the 20,000 people in 2019, there were more than 20,000 people. In 2020, they were close to 14,000 when the camp burned down. And then after the camp burned down, they were on the streets for many days. Then the government constructed the new Moria, the new camp. They were rounded up from the streets, taken to the new camp. When they entered the new camp, it was less than 10,000 that entered. So many of them sort of left, found a way to leave. After the camp burned down, also, there was a bit of a call to action for some of the countries. But Germany vowed to take X number of refugees. Portugal took about 800, if I remember correctly. And then a lot of their asylum applications sped up after that. So at the moment, currently in this new camp, there are less than 2,000 people. Not to say there are not still issues, but it did speed up the asylum applications for the vast majority.
So who's your favorite character in the book?
That's a good question.
My favorite character is Fereshte. So she's
There's
based
some
on
people.
she's based on a real
Okay.
girl that I met, and like 8-9-year-old Afghan girl. Hello.
Hello, sorry.
No, it's okay.